Whilst Gnome is in the process of properly supporting fractional scaling, especially in the Wayland context, which will eventually happen, when the toolkit GTK also supports fractional scaling, by which I mean the current way that fractional scaling is done is scaling to the next highest integer and scaling down. This leads to a lot of blurriness and just isn't exactly a good solution. But whilst that's happening, Gnome is also in the process of fixing its kinda terrible UI for showing UI scaling. Fractional scaling on Gnome isn't normally available. Now, any of the Ubuntu users out there might be saying, no, it literally is. Remember, Ubuntu does not ship a vanilla version of Gnome. This right here is Fedora. This is running stock Gnome as Fedora does. The only options we have are 100% scale and 200% scale. Now, 200% scale is basically unusable unless you have like a 4K display. Whereas over on the Ubuntu side, it looks like this instead. We still have the 100% and 200%, but we also have this fractional scaling button as well. Enabling this is going to enable the option of fractional scaling. Now ignore the resolution changing, it's just my VM being weird. Now we have 125%, 150%, and if I raise up my resolution to 1920 by 1080, now we have a list of options going up to 225%. This isn't some weird Ubuntu and canonical magic. All they're doing is a very minor patch to Gnome to have this button available, but also running a command that you can run on any install of Gnome. So fractional scaling right now is an experimental feature, and you can enable it on Fedora or anything else, just keep in mind that it isn't going to be perfect. But regardless of how you enable it, I think we can all agree that having a drop-down menu like this or a pill menu isn't exactly the best way this information can be shown. It doesn't really give you any indication about how big the scale is going to be, so if you plug into an unknown monitor resolution like you normally run a 1080p display, but you take your laptop to a 2560 by 1440 display, maybe some weird ultra-wide resolution, you gotta mess with it a little bit to get it to the scale that you're actually comfortable with. On a desktop system like this, doesn't really matter, but if you're trying to do a presentation, that can be kind of annoying to fiddle with. And that UI is exactly what is being worked on by Alan Day. New design for fractional scaling setting. It's very similar to what was happening before, with a couple of really nice changes. The current fractional scaling setting is just a long list of percentage options. If this setting is going to be exposed more widely, which I think it is, considering that things like this are being worked on, we ought to do a better job. Specifically, we need to reduce the number of options presented and ideally have some kind of preview. The other thing we need is a switch for legacy compatibility mode to allow overriding the defaults in order for people to use certain X11 applications. Now, this is still very much a concept, a mock-up, and in discussion. This is not implemented in the GNOME codebase. You're not going to go and download, like, the Git version or something like that, and then suddenly go and use it. But what you're seeing right now, this is for a single display. This happens to be for a built-in display, but it'd be exactly the same if it was a single external display. But there are other configurations you can use monitors in as well. For example, you can have two separate displays. In this case, the monitor arrangement is still exactly the same, but if you go a little bit further down, you have the displays here with drop-down menus. Now, under the drop-down menu, along with the stuff you always had before, now you have this scaling option like it was showing for that single inbuilt display. So it lets you have different scaling for your different monitors, because you might have a 1080p display and a 4K display, or an ultra-wide and, I don't know, 1280 by 800 because you got this weird setup and you don't want to get rid of one of your old displays. But the other option is to have mirrored displays. Now in this case, there's not really any reason to have individual monitor control because the displays are mirrored. So in this case, it just shows you the same as what you'd have for a single display. This is all mostly the same as what GNOME is currently doing. The major differences are the inclusion of the preview and also the legacy high DPI compatibility mode, and also the fact that it's actually being shown to the user editor, which is not something that's being done in a default version of GNOME, at least at this point. This sort of preview here is very much inspired by what's being done over on the macOS side. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because macOS pays their UX designers a lot of money to do things really well. So this is what macOS does. You've got the preview here, but then on the left-hand side, you also have a preview of what it might look like on the actual desktop itself. This part isn't being included, but the designer did say that if this wasn't too difficult to implement, they would like to see this sort of thing as well. Because while it's nice to have this here to give you an idea of the text itself, it would be a lot easier to see what's going on, to see a representation of the window on your actual desktop. Sure, it's not going to be exactly perfect, and even this says it looks like 2560 by 1440. It's not even entirely certain that that is the exact size it's going to be. But it doesn't have to be an exact size, it more has to be a relative size to give you an indication of how much the difference is going to be, because right now, it's pretty hard to tell what the difference between 100% and 150% is without actually going and enabling the option and then seeing for yourself, and then disabling the option, going to 175, okay, maybe that's a little bit too small, okay, maybe I want to go to 200, wait, okay, maybe I actually want to go back to 125, oh, screw all of this, let's just go back to 100% because all of this is too difficult and I'm not even going to worry about scaling, I'll just squint a little bit. But let's delve a little bit into the mind of a UI and UX designer. So you might have spotted that the text it's using is lorem ipsum. This is a pretty standard placeholder text. You could probably throw some other things in there. You could probably make like a custom paragraph. Apple, for their preview, makes use of some marketing material. All of these things are perfectly fine. The text needs to be something that is unoffensive and just does the job of demonstrating what the change is going to be. But the designer has something weird to say about it. I should have said, one aspect of the design that I'm not sure about is the preview. Clearly including lorem ipsum isn't ideal. But what's the alternative, and how to make it easier for translators? Now, I don't think you need to translate lorem ipsum. All it's there to do is show you the change in font sizing. Now, I guess it would be nicer for languages that don't use the same character set as English, like Chinese, like Korean, like Arabic, that having it in their own character set would give you a better idea for that specific kind of font, but it's not exactly necessary. And I guess it could look a little out of place if the rest of your system is translated, but then there's this one bit that uses a completely different character set. Once again, not really that important, but if there was a way to address it, then maybe try and do so. So one user suggests, why don't we just use Pango? This automatically does the translation and localization for you, and in this case, it's using the quick brown fox. This could come back in Spanish or any other language that you need it to bring back. And, you know, this could do the job perfectly well as well. And this method is already being used for the GNOME font previewer, so it's not like it's something they've just never worked with before, it's already involved in the GNOME environment, so bringing it into an extra thing just seems like a logical choice to go with. As for that legacy high DPI compatibility mode, this has a pop-up icon right next to it. That says, allows apps which use legacy technologies to display correctly on high DPI screens. This can affect other aspects of display handling, including scaling. Now, I know what that personally means. I know what legacy technology means here, but if you read this pop-up, this doesn't explain anything besides what's already being said on the button itself. I know that it's legacy high DPI compatibility, but what is legacy high DPI compatibility? What does that affect? Why is that even a separate option? It's related to Xorg and Xwayland, but there needs to be a better way to explain what it's actually doing. If you do enable it, it's basically going to disable the fractional scaling and only have the integer scaling instead. So 100%, 200%, 300%, so on and so forth. I know the designer is trying to keep things very simple, but I think he's gone a little bit too simple here, and it probably should make some sort of mention of X or X Wayland or something like that to give you an indication of what legacy actually means in this case. This is a big part of the reason why this discussion phase is very important, and why it's so nice that we can do everything in a repo like this and anybody can get involved. Because issues like this can be found early and dealt with early before they get implemented, and then, once they're in that implementation stage, it's a little bit harder to fix them up, because then you have to make a new version, you have to ship it out to the users. Do you do it in a big version that was going to exist anyway? Do you push out a hotfix? Then the distros have to package it. It's just a big nightmare. So dealing with that before it's implemented is always a good thing. This change by itself is not going to bring proper fractional scaling to Gnome, is not going to deal with the Wayland issues, is not going to deal with the X11 issues. It's just one of the many puzzle pieces to get fractional scaling in the hands of Gnome users, and not just in the hands of Ubuntu users that have an extra patch installed that go and enable an experimental feature, but in the hands of every single Gnome user, whether they're on Fedora, whether they're on Ubuntu, whether they're on any other distro out there. Eventually, probably in GTK 5, I would imagine, we're going to start seeing fractional scaling being a proper feature on the Gnome desktop. And as much as I don't like the Gnome style of interface, this just isn't my kind of thing. From what Gnome is trying to do, the UI that they are aiming for, I think this fits really well. I'm not sure where you could fit a proper desktop preview. Maybe here, maybe... I don't know. I've not looked at Gnome's design principles enough to really know where it should go. All I know is that when I see it, I just get reminded of a tablet. And, that's not exactly what I'm looking for from a desktop. But if that's what they're going for, it works well for them. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you use Gnome? Do you think this new UI is actually a good thing? Do you think it doesn't really need it? Why do you need a preview? Just go and press the buttons and it does the thing. I would love to know. So if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, Pay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and you've been Gnomed.